Welcome to the Sublation magazine show or the CutroneZone, or maybe it's Diet Soap. It's a special podcast. We're not sure what to call it. I'm Douglas Lain. I'll be moderating today's events. With me today is Caleb Maupin and Chris Cutrone. I'm going to let them both introduce themselves, starting with Caleb Maupin. Go ahead.
Sure. I'm Caleb Maupin, journalist, political analyst. I lead the Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org, anti-imperialist. Yeah, there you go.
And Chris?
Well, I'm the last Marxist. I'm the original lead organizer of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and I'm a university college professor of critical theory, and also the initiator of the campaign for a socialist party.
All right. So I should say up front that I am not a neutral observer here. I am friends with Chris. I have aligned Sublation with the campaign. But today I'm going to try to play the role of everyman leftist. Step back and just listen. And if I need to intervene occasionally with a question, I will. Maybe what we should do to start with is just have Caleb describe what he thinks his project is about and what's most important for leftist or Marxist or socialist politics today. And then we can have Chris give his side of the story and then also respond. And then you guys can go back and forth responding. Does that sound all right, Caleb?
Sure. I mean, one thing, if you don't mind, I would like to ask Chris some questions just because he's had a lot of life experience, it seems, and he's been involved in a lot of things that I think would be of interest. I'd be curious to hear, as someone who's studied the history of the left and, he lived through some things, was part of some things that I want to hear how he saw them. I think Chris
Sure.
That would be great.
Valuable insights. So,
okay. But why don't we do that? Why don't we go with you go first, then Chris, and then you can start asking each other questions. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sure. I guess just to quickly summarize, I mean, Marx's writing is there's this whole industry to like obfuscate Marx. If you go to college, it's like you learn about, well, actually there was the young Marx and there was the old Marx and they didn't agree. And there's this whole thing. And I think Marxism is actually pretty straightforward. Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels lays out that human history is advancing, right? And that capitalism has this built-in problem of poverty created by abundance. And Marx touched on this in The Poverty of Philosophy. This is in Capital. That, never before in history have we had an economic system where people are homeless because there are too many houses, where people are hungry because there's too much food. And that Marxism was a call for society as a whole, led by the industrial proletariat, to seize control of the centers of economic power, take control of the government first, and then use the government to centralize the means of production in order to overcome this problem so that we could continue to have wealth and abundance for all and eventually get to a world with so much wealth and abundance we don't need a state, right? And that's, critique of the Goethe program. That's what Marx is talking about, is basically, capitalism is irrational, the anarchy of production. Now, Marx had predicted that in Europe, eventually what was going to happen was that this problem of poverty amid plenty, overproduction, tendency of the falling rate of profits would get so much worse, and the population would just keep getting poorer, and there'd be more and more unemployment, and eventually the German workers and probably the British workers and the French workers would rise up. They would tear down their international borders, rise up and seize their factories. Well, and it didn't happen, right? And that was the crisis of Marxism, right? And the crisis of Marxism gave birth to revisionism and Edward Bernstein and what we now call social democracy, right? Which kind of came out of that, which is the idea that, well, the West and the Western system just kind of gradually turns into socialism one step at a time. And that's what AOC believes. That's what Bernie and all of them believe, right? That's what the British Labour Party believes, basically. And then you had another current called Bolshevism, which was Lenin, that came up with this new theory of imperialism, the capitalism. The reason that the Western countries weren't, the poor people weren't just getting poorer and poorer and poorer and heading toward a crisis, was because the big monopolies in the Western countries, the industrialists, had become subservient to banks and the rise of finance capital, and that they were now super exploiting the planet. And as a result, the working class in the homeland became stratified, the aristocracy of labor, and that the revolutionary energy was now in the East and it was in the colonized world. And that the struggle of socialism would come into being not through Western workers seizing their factories, but rather countries kept in a state of underdevelopment by the big monopolies, breaking out of the Western system, seizing control of their economies, and using a centralized planned economy to achieve basic industrialization, which is what the Soviet Union did and all of that. And that's kind of, communism was this movement against the Western system of desperately poor, impoverished countries seizing control of their industries and carrying out basic modernization. Social democracy was the idea that the Western system is we're going to kind of make the Western system gradually be more and more efficient and create more of a welfare state and gradually achieve the ideals of the Western world: liberty, equality, fraternity, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, by gradually having the working class take power. And those are the two movements. But as a result of the 20th century, we're now in this situation where the West is continuing to have a big long-term crisis. And I mean, we're having a lot more authoritarianism, a lot more low wages. I believe it's rooted in what Marx wrote about, the tendency of the falling rate of profit and all of that. And as a result of Leninism and Bolshevism, we now have this new economy rising around the world in the BRICS countries, where, they are continuing to rise. And while there's a lot of injustice and corruption and, they have their problems, these aren't, socialist utopias, but, Russia and China have largely broken out of the Western system. And because profits are not in command, even though there's inequality and all of that, they're able to lift their people up. And that this is kind of the crisis that we're in. And it forces us living in the West to go, what do we do about it? Right. And I would say that ultimately we need to build a mass movement of working people to demand jobs, healthcare, and education, and also to demand that we break out of this Western system ourselves and become closer to the rising BRICS economy. And that, the call for an anti-monopoly coalition that would include, lower level capitalists, business owners, and others, but a call for a government that is pro-growth and friendly to the rising BRICS countries. I think that's where we need to go. And, we've raised the slogan, government of action to fight for working families. And for the longest time, I thought this was leftism, but leftism is something completely different. Leftism has morphed into, I'm sure we're going to talk about that. Leftism has morphed into something completely different. What I say, what I'm advocating here, generally makes me a fascist, according to the left. If you think so.
Right.
So we're in a new ballpark. That's how I see things. I hope that was a quick summary. So there we go.
Good. So I'd agree with a lot of that. I think that I understand the significance of Lenin and the Russian Revolution a little bit differently. And I think that what's hanging over us in the 21st century is the question of whether Marxism, at its height in the advanced capitalist world, was a phenomenon of first and second wave industrialization and faded after the passing of that moment. That's one question, the question of post-Marxism. I think, rather, that there was a political crisis in Marxism that we never recovered from. And that what happened was that Marxism became divided. And, if you think about it, in the 20th century, ostensible Marxists took literally every position on every issue. There were anti-fascist Marxists, there were pro-fascist Marxists. There were pro-imperialist Marxists, there were anti-imperialist Marxists. There was pro-queer Marxists, anti-queer Marxists. Right? There were racist Marxists and anti-racist Marxists. And so that tells me that we haven't had Marxism for a very long time. And at least in the sense of a self-conscious, historically self-conscious, class-conscious in that sense, leadership of a mass socialist movement in the world. And one of the effects of that was the liquidation of Marxism into what I consider to be kind of petty bourgeois democracy, petty bourgeois radicalism. And that's what one saw for the 20th century up to the present. Now, our current moment, which I have referred to as the Millennial Left moment, and now, in the aftermath of that, has been the crisis of neoliberalism, has been the crisis of a specific form of capitalism that came about at the end of the 20th century and went into crisis in the 21st century. And I have some theoretical differences with how you articulated it. One thing in particular, which is that I would consider the imperative to capital accumulation to be related to, but distinct from, profit seeking per se, to profitability per se. Meaning that I think that capitalism is living under the law of capital accumulation, the imperative, the need for capital accumulation. And I think that getting beyond capitalism means production without the imperative to accumulate capital. So, and I think that we've been living under the task of that since Marx's time. I think that Marx saw that in the middle of the 19th century. He saw that after the first wave of the Industrial Revolution, that bourgeois social relations, we needed to get beyond that. And the contradiction with the industrial forces of production showed the necessity and possibility of overcoming that. And it took this perverse form of capital accumulation, hence capitalism, which is different from profitism or marketism or, the various ways that people think of capitalism. So I think that that's important because I think that the so-called actually existing socialist countries, that's a term from my youth. People don't really use that term anymore. I think that they considered to live under world capitalism and were in various mediated ways, including military competition, compelled to accumulate capital in a way that made them ultimately compatible with capitalism. And so you see that with China today, that I would say that China is not independent of world capitalism, but is an integral part of it. Not only is the US dependent on China, but China is dependent on the US. So that's how I'd sort of introduce a wrinkle into this. And I think that it bears on a kind of strategic perspective with respect to the task in the United States, which is independent proletarian socialism that steers clear of capitalist politics in all of its various forms, including capitalist politics out of power. So including kind of petty bourgeois radicalism or petty bourgeois democracy, which lately now in recent years in the crisis of neoliberalism has gone under the rubric of populism. So left populism, right populism. And I look back to Eugene Debs and the period of the Second International and how proletarian socialism distinguished itself and broke from and was opposed to both populism and progressivism. And I think that that still stands as an imperative for us today.
Wow. Okay. I'm sorry I stepped away for a moment, but I heard most everything that was said. And I do want to open it up now to let you two talk to each other more directly rather than just clarifying your positions. But before I do, I want to point out that it does seem to me, if I take the role of, the everyday leftist, right, it does seem to me that you two have more in common than you would have differences, that you both are aiming at allowing the working class or the proletariat or assisting the proletariat as they try to take political power to transform society, and that the differences between you hinge on almost seemingly technical matters, or historical interpretations, and it's difficult to sort those out in a single conversation. So, Mike, I guess I want to ask Caleb if he can tell me what he thinks his most profound disagreement would be with Chris. And then, Chris, you could tell me what you think the most profound central disagreement is between the two of you before we then go on to just have you two talk more directly to each other. So, Caleb?
Well, Doug, I wish I could do that, but that kind of points to why I wanted to just ask Chris some questions, because Chris is kind of a legendary figure. You're like the Phantom of the Opera in Marxism, right?
Mm-hmm.
I first started hearing about Platypus back in like 2010, right? And it was this new group that was having like forums with people from different parties speaking. I think you did something with Tariq Ali or whatever. And I was at the U.S. Social Forum in 2010. I was a member of the Workers' World Party in those days. And it was just kind of, there's this group of people and they're kind of an intellectual circle and they're grouped around this guy who was formerly a Spartacist, and the Spartacists really hate him and they show up at his events and yell and scream at him and call him all these awful names. But it's not really clear what they believe. And then I listened to some of the material and it wasn't clear like what was representing a position and what was almost like, it seemed like the group was kind of trolling the left. That was kind of like the main thing they would do. I remember
asking questions.
Yeah,
I guess counts for trolling these days.
Yeah, a Platypus guy walked up to our table when I was in the Workers' World Party, and we had a Mumia, free Mumia stuff, and and said, like, well, what did Mumia have to do with the working class? And I started explaining, well, Mumia was a former Black Panther, the Black Panthers were, and then he then proceeded to tell me, well, the working class would want to kill Mumia because he was involved with a lumpen thug organization, but then I don't think he actually thought that. I think he was trying to provoke me, right? And it seemed like to some degree or other, your organization was about like making the left uncomfortable and forcing them to ask questions they weren't asking. But then there was a lot of innuendo, and I could never find like a stated position. So I'm curious about, like, I guess, what I was widely told was that your organization, Platypus, was formed to support the U.S. invasion of Iraq. That your job was basically to go around, that you supported the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and you thought it was a war of liberation. And that real leftists should support it. That anti-imperialist governments like Iraq's government, were neo-feudalism. That Leninism was the worst thing that had ever happened. And that
my goodness,
is that accurate in any way? What I was told?
No.
Okay.
So first of all, we'd have to distinguish. It's been 20 years now that I've been doing Platypus.
Yeah.
And especially in the last, like, I would say 7 years. So since I stepped down as president of Platypus in 2018, in the first Trump term, I have written more in my own voice and in a more literary way, including in a provocative way, than I did previously. And that Platypus as a project is distinct from me as a public figure. So Platypus really is about hosting the conversation on, as we put it, the death of the left. Meaning all the disjecta membra, all the flotsam and jetsam, all the debris of the 20th century left, our attitude towards all of that is that it's all dead. However, each fragment contains part of the truth. And so therefore, we're very ecumenical, meaning the thing that irritated people on the left was that we would invite other people to speak at forums that they objected to including in the conversation. And that's the way the left is. The left pretends that the other factions don't exist, the other tendencies don't exist, or they object to them very fiercely. And so, we got a sort of a bad reputation. Our very first forum was on what is imperialism and why should we be against it? Just to say, look, we can't take anything of the past for granted. And it could very well be that a proletarian socialist left, informed by Marxism, would have to come back to the old classic positions. However, we can't take those for granted, and we do have to reconstruct the rationale for those positions, because they've gotten lost in a tangle of rhetoric and propaganda. The theory has been muddled. The basic political orientation has been muddled. People have gotten completely turned around. As I said, Marxism has been on every side of every issue, literally, quite literally. So that's what people objected to. And they were like, well, if you're inviting so-and-so, like Doug Henwood, Left Business Observer, objected to having an RCP USA follower of Bob Avakian on a panel with him. And, it's kind of like, well, look, and it was a conversation about the 2008 crisis and the aftermath and Occupy Wall Street. And we wanted to include a range of voices: liberal, socialist, anarchist, ostensibly communist, And so it's kind of like, well, if you're inviting so-and-so, you must be up to no good. That shows a hidden agenda. And it really didn't, because we were trying to curate not debates. We were trying to get around the stale debates and the useless polemics and really have people reflect on, okay, what do you really think? And especially from the older generation, from like the baby boomer 60s generation, it's like, okay, after your life on the left, what do you actually think, really? Can we have a reflective moment now? And there was a British anarchist, Trevor Bark, who characterized Platypus as halftime team talk. Right, it's like from football, from soccer, right? So during halftime, the team huddles and they're just like, okay, where are we at in this game now? What are we doing? What are we going to do in the second half? And again, generally people on the left have their little organizations, and they're very vested in those organizations. They have very high dues paying, memberships, people tithing. They are attached to their ideology and their propaganda. But my sense was that the millennial left was not going to be able to really get much out of these people, and in fact that there were obstacles to what I saw the millennial left aspiring to do, which is reestablish a socialist politics.
So it's more of an academic project rather than a attendance,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Is what you're
And the
telling
reason for that is I am an academic, and my students came to me during the anti-war movement. So first of all, let's clear that up. Of course, I was against the Iraq War. Of course.
Okay.
I was.
Yeah.
And my friends were. And my students, their general sentiment was they were against the Iraq War. However, there were pro-war leftists. There was Christopher Hitchens. There were people who were not pro-war, but also didn't support the Iraqi insurgency, like the Iraqi Communist Party and the Worker Communist Party of Iraq. And we wanted to, have that conversation. Paul Berman, I think that was really the other person that Doug Henwood objected to being on a panel with him. He objected to the RCPer, but he objected to Paul Berman, who had written a book on terrorism and liberalism, and how the new left had come to support terrorism and had gotten itself turned around. And basically, again, we can't take anything for granted, especially because, on the imperialism front, a lot of anti-imperialism, like Cindy Sheehan during the first, anti-war movement post 9/11 around the Iraq War, she's not a Marxist or a socialist. She's kind of a petty bourgeois, democratic, kind of liberal, like
in more recent years, she's pivoted. I know she's very close to the Rayo Light group at this point. In the last decade, she's less visible now. And my understanding is she's close to like an Enver Hoxha Maoist kind of trade union group that's kind of secretive called Rayo Light, Revolutionary Labor.
She's been more radicalized.
Yeah, she's close to them. They were involved in her congressional campaigns and stuff. And
who was the it's not Wesley Clark, no, Ramsey Clark.
I worked for him. Yeah,
Ramsey Clark. This is a perfect example. Not a Marxist, not a socialist. A radlib is what we used to call these people. A radlib, meaning a petty bourgeois Democrat. That's what anti-imperialism is. Meaning there's no proletarian socialist anti-imperialism. What there is anti-imperialism that thinks that imperialism is like a bad policy. Wars are a bad policy. Certain, financial policies, the IMF and the World Bank, might be bad at the level of we should do something different. We, meaning capitalism, should do something different. And I feel like, no, we got to aspire to more than that. And, it's got to be more than a kind of dissident capitalist. I think that I wrote about this, about how Obama brought in Chuck Hagel, who was a Republican Party dissenter from the Iraq War, as, in his administration.
Well, I used to, I was in the International Action Center, and I was the media spokesperson for the International Action Center during the Occupy Wall Street protests. And that's how I started appearing on Press TV and RT and Turkish television and such. And I used to go over to Ramsey Clark's apartment a lot because the International Action Center was always, there were a lot of Syrian Americans who really appreciated his opposition to the insurgency. And like they would send like big boatloads of like Syrian food would be like delivered to the office. And so I would sometimes go over to his office, and I got to meet his granddaughters. Actually, we had a birthday party for Ramsey Clark, and I got to meet his granddaughters. And I guess his son is an attorney at the Department of Justice, and he was quite old. He was in his 80s, and we had like an event, and there was a lot of like foreign diplomats there. And they basically put me at the kids' table with his granddaughters. That was kind of funny. And but Ramsey Clark, I mean, was he a communist? I don't think he would have ever described himself that way. He would have said he was anti-capitalist, I think. And his main thing was, he was very like, he realized, having been on the inside as in the U.S. in general, how ugly the stuff really is.
Yes.
And he also had a real awareness of how dangerous nuclear war was.
Sure.
And that, he had come from this kind of like, he was almost like a legacy. I think his father was an attorney general also, right? I believe.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, there's a long history.
He was just part of the Democrat machine, but he was inspired by Kennedy.
Member of the ruling class.
Yeah, right. Definitely. And he was inspired by Kennedy and the civil rights movement. And he got in. He was the attorney general under Johnson, and he fought with the FBI. And the FBI was not beholden to the executive branch of the government. That's what he was
Hoover.
basically describing. Yeah, Hoover and him did not get along, and he couldn't tell Hoover what he was on paper. He was Hoover's boss, but he was not. And
But he was not. Right.
Yeah, the FBI was doing all kinds of stuff, and the FBI didn't like the civil rights movement. And Johnson, they liked it, but they wanted to control it. They didn't want Malcolm.
Of course.
Yeah, and that, and then, you know, after, you know, and I think Nixon said the first thing I will do when I get in office is fire Ramsey Clark. And so then after that, he just kind of became an anti-war activist, and he was somebody who'd been on the inside, and he became an international lawyer. And, you know, it was interesting because Ramsey Clark was a really good friend of Lyndon LaRouche. Lyndon LaRouche apparently came to visit him at least once a year, and they would sit and talk for hours. Workers' World Party that I was in, and which ran the International Action Center, which was Ramsey Clark's group, they thought Lyndon LaRouche was a fascist. And so it was one of the most bizarre things. The other thing is that Ramsey Clark was very interested in like a lot of issues that I guess now would be labeled conspiracy theories, I guess. For example, he would file lawsuits against the Skull and Bones Society pretty frequently. You know, and I guess they have a corpse in their house which violates like law, and so like on behalf of like they have a Native American dead body in their hall, and so he was always, like once a year he would sue Skull and Bones for having a dead body inside their building in violation of the rights of the indigenous people or something.
So a dissident ruling class person. And
he was interested in that. And then I asked him one time, just point blank, because I had been told Lyndon LaRouche was like a fascist. He was like a Nazi. And so I said, why do you what's with that? And he smiled. And he said, well, Lyndon LaRouche is a smart guy. And he smiled. He said, not as smart as he thinks he is, though. And he just kind of laughed. And I thought that was funny. And that Ramsey Clark was his own thing. The Workers' World Party had a relationship with him that started, I think, in the late 80s, right? And Ramsey Clark was also particularly loved by a lot of the governments that are at odds with the United States. Right?
Of course, yeah.
You know, and he was frequently flying to those countries. He was Milosevic's attorney in The Hague.
Yeah, he would make a legal case for the people on the receiving end of U.S. imperialism.
Yeah, and the other thing was that he was vehemently opposed to the International Criminal Court. Like, that was one of his main things, was the ICC is absolutely illegal, and it spells the end of international sovereignty. And that,
well, I was going to say, there's that, and there's also the fact that it's supposed to address war crimes, but it might be an agency for covering them up.
Yeah, and that if there had been any talk of an ICC when the UN was formed, the UN wouldn't have been formed. Like, you know, it was like
people would have objected.
Right. Yeah, it would. I mean, that the ICC is the end of national sovereignty. It has absolutely no jurisdiction, and Republicans in America think that. Interestingly,
sure.
Like we have the Hague Act that if there's ever an American tried in the Hague, the USA will bomb the Hague. Like that's in law. Like I mean,
look, the Republican Party is not.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Go ahead.
I just want to know. Caleb, when you were forming that relationship with Ramsey Clark and getting involved with him, the communist group that you were part of, how did they justify turning to bourgeois politics and legal strategies as opposed to organizing workers independently? What was the logic that said that this could lead in any way to developing a power that could institute socialism?
Well, okay, so I'm not here to defend them, right? I have big differences with Workers' World Party and with the Marxist tendency.
No, but nonetheless, what was the logic? I'm not asking you to defend them. I'm asking you what the logic of it was.
So their feeling was that that a mass anti-war movement was needed, right? And that, you know, that ultimately the real enemy of the workers was at home, right? And that it was, you know, and that a mass anti-war movement would agitate about how our government doesn't care about working people. It spends money on, you know, wars around the world. And that the Workers' World Party, they still, I think what's left of them still controls the Boston School Bus Drivers Union. And, you know, they had a lot of labor influence in Detroit. They were leaders of the Detroit newspaper strike and all of that. They had a lot of labor influence, but they also felt that it was kind of their internationalist duty to build a mass anti-war movement, and
right, in the US.
And that they focused a lot on fighting against the people. I mean, you remember during the Iraq War, there were two big anti-war coalitions: Answer, which was run by Workers' World Party,
Right,
now
Answer.
PSL, and then there was United for Peace and Justice. And
Right.
they felt that the United for Peace and Justice crowd were the pro-imperialists. They were like trying, because United for Peace and Justice had supported sanctions on Iraq. They said sanctions, not war. United for Peace and Justice often wouldn't allow pro-Palestine speakers because they said that was too alienating and stuff. And so their focus in the anti-war movement is like, we're going to build the wing of the anti-war movement that is solidly aligned with the anti-imperialist countries, right? Whereas there's this other wing of the anti-war movement that's tied to the Democratic Party that isn't. And we're going to like battle for permits and try to outmaneuver them to get the permits so that the people that are just against the war will come to our rally, and that'll align them with the people around the world fighting U.S. imperialism. I think that was kind of their approach. And it was like, we're going to build a mass anti-war movement. We're also going to be involved in labor unions. We're going to be heavily involved in the struggle against racism and supporting Black nationalists, et cetera. And that by doing that, we'll build, kind of a mass movement that'll eventually overthrow capitalism in the United States. I don't think that's the strategy. That's certainly not the strategy for political innovation. That's how they saw things. Yeah.
So, I mean, my sense, having come up, when I did as a Gen X leftist, is that the left that the millennials faced were all legacies of the 1980s. That there was a kind of institutionalization of a kind of 60s protest demo style, version of what I would consider to be like popular front politics. I am going to use some language that's going to sound like Trotskyist because that, is part of my background.
Oh, I got plenty to ask you about that too, but go on. Yeah.
Right. And so basically, I would not think that there really is much of a difference between the Answer Coalition and United for Peace and Justice, because I would see them as more or less hoping to pressure the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
The anti-war movement that the millennials encountered disappeared as soon as Obama was elected.
Mm-hmm. That is true.
That shows that no matter how ostensibly radical or aligned with, other countries, and the main enemy is at home, despite all of that, and there is such a thing as bourgeois defeatism. There's real bourgeois defeatism. There are members of the ruling class who actively try to sabotage the effort of their own country and who do aid others who are militarily opposing their own country for political reasons. That happens.
What political reasons? I mean, do they try to
want a regime change here? They want a regime change here. In other words, you align with other countries to help topple a regime here. Well, and the regime here is the form of things like, FBI led by J. Edgar Hoover, or whatever party in power, or the deep state. I mean, however they conceive of it, there is such a thing as bourgeois defeatism. And I think that proletarian socialism has to be very different from that.
Well, I've written a lot about the Yankee and Cowboy War. I quote Carl Oglesby and Carol Quigley, and that, there's the Anglo-American establishment, the old money of New England that is tied with intelligence more and funds like liberal activism.
Used to be.
Yeah, versus the McCarthyist, lower levels of capital that are industrialists that are tied with the military industrial complex. And that's kind of been the analysis that I've put forward of the divisions within the ruling class. And the Cold War was largely, it was at the beginning of the Cold War, you had McCarthyism. Right. And McCarthyism started out as just an effort to kind of clean house and get any pro-Soviet sentiments out. Then it pivoted very quickly into this kind of vaguely populist movement that was actually going after the CIA and FBI. And so then you had this liberal blowback that was against McCarthyism, and out of that came the New Left and all of that. And that, divisions in the ruling class over material interests kind of define it, and that
over power.
Yeah, over power and economic gain. I mean, they're tied in with different industries, threatened
political
by
power too, though. We shouldn't discount the struggle for political power.
Yeah,
and that can be a motivator in and of itself.
Yeah, Bonapartism, right?
Absolutely,
Bonaparte seized power in France and imprisoned a huge section of his own class and deported them because, in the overall interests of France as a capitalist country, they needed to stabilize the economy, and that came with the suppression of their own class. 18th Brumaire by Marx is a book that a lot of people, it's very hard to read because it's full of so many current references. But it's a really important piece where he's talking about the ruling class fighting itself amid a political crisis. I think it's really important,
and we still live with that, right? So I mean, again, this is where I would say, and I would just also point out, I think the left I think the problem with the Millennial Left was that it didn't get out from under the dead hand of the 60s. So it didn't really transcend either the 1930s or the 1960s. It sort of dealt with a mixed legacy of Great Depression era old leftism and new leftism, Vietnam era and civil rights era new leftism. And it remained beholden to those frameworks in a way that made it untrue to its own time. In other words, I think the task is different now. I think the issues are somewhat different. And I also think the power structure is different. We're not dealing with the Eastern establishment anymore. Like it's there are, of course, ruling class, like long-standing wealthy families and, politically connected people. But there's been a generational turnover. There was a generational turnover after the 60s. And we're dealing with, something a little bit different now. And also the world situation is different. It's post-Cold War, which I don't want to either forget or put too much significance on that, because in some ways, from the ruling class's perspective, the Cold War was just a bump in the road.
Well, I want to ask you, this is what I wanted to ask you. I have become lately much more fascinated by the world of Orthodox Trotskyism. I wrote this pamphlet in defense of Jerry Healy, right? And the reason I wrote this is because last year, DSA churned out a screed bashing Jerry Healy, even though he's been dead for 35 years, right? And they churned out a book on Jerry Healy. And the World Socialist website got very angry, and they showed that it was full of, dishonesty. And I read it, and I was just blown away by how the DSA author just knew so little about the dynamics of leftism. Like at one point he said in an interview, he said, well, the reason people joined the Socialist Labor League was because if you thought the Communist Party was too rigid and doctrinaire, but you weren't reformist like the Labor Party, they were the only alternative. And it's just like, that's ridiculous. Anyone who knows anything about the left in Britain, that was just not how the dynamics were.
Right.
And it was like Jerry Healy's been dead for 35 years, but DSA churned out this book to kill him from the grave, kill him, dig him up from the grave and kill him again.
Yep.
And I find that interesting. And so you were in the Spartacus League. I used to have a subscription to Workers' Vanguard, and I really enjoyed the history pieces, the stuff on war, the history. I enjoyed that. I remember when I was in Marxist, part of the so-called left, I found Spartacus on the street very difficult to deal with because you never argue with them about what you actually disagreed with. It was always, well, you're a Democrat, you're a Democrat, you're a Democrat. And in a way, right, we were Democrats, but it was like, let's talk in a way where we were actually learning from each other. But I guess so. You were in the SL, in the International Communist League or whatever, in the late 80s and early 90s, the time of the Iraq War, right?
In my college years, yes.
And so I'm curious. I know that I heard stories of when the Gulf War was happening in Cleveland, right? The Workers' World Party had a bus to take a bunch of liberals to the Gulf War protest in DC, and at 2 a.m. or whatever, when the bus was loading up, the Spartacists came and had a picket line against the bus, right? And there was a fist fight, or something like that. And then I guess the story that I heard, I wasn't there. I was 4 years old when this was happening. The story that I heard was that, that they were they had a picket line against getting on the bus because it was a reformist rally, but they all had bought tickets. And so then they tried to get on the bus that they had been picketing. And that's when there was a scuffle and some people got hurt, and it was you're going to picket. They had a picket line against the bus, and then they wanted to get on the bus and go to the rally or something. And it was
they were registering their ideological differences. Let me clear up one thing. So I'm not a Trotskyist.
Yeah.
Not because I disagree with, this or that of Trotsky himself, but because I think the Trotskyist strategy of splitting and rebuilding, regrouping the left through polemical fights and splits, I don't think that that's what we have to deal with now. I think that Trotsky's perspective, whether right or wrong, was specific to the 1930s when you had mass socialist and communist parties, both of which had run into a kind of impasse in the era of fascism and the lead up to World War II. And I don't think that that strategy held after World War II. And yet, obviously, still Trotsky was this kind of haunting presence. Now, you mentioned Jerry Healy. Now, the Spartacists came out of the Shachtmanites here in the United States. And then they tried to join the what they thought were the Orthodox Trotskyists.
Right. Well, they were with Shachtman, right? Robertson was with Shachtman, but then they went into the SWP.
It went to the SWP, and then they discovered that the SWP was Pabloite, and then they ended up in Jerry Healy's like kind of international network, and then they were either expelled or quit that.
Yeah.
Right. So there was basically
tendency, right?
Right. They were the revolutionary tendency in the SWP, and then they were their own group split, and some of them remained with Healy, and some of them did not. So Robertson went on his own, and Tim Woolforth went with Healy. And so, this is the fragmentation of Trotskyism that it's notorious for. But basically, yeah, their strategy, their tactics were to polemicize against the left, hoping to peel off cadre from other organizations. And they saw this as revolutionary regroupment, which I was like, yeah, that's not really working. It seemed to have had a plausibility in the 1970s during the Leninist turn on the New Left, when there was a lot of movement and motion, cross currents between Maoism and Trotskyism. But then by the time Reagan and Thatcher came along, the left really kind of ossified into its various tendencies, and there was much less movement among the tendencies.
No, I remember that there was.
Can I interject real quick? I want to ask Chris a question. How did those tendencies ossify? Why did they hold? What?
Good point.
What would the people who joined them get from one tendency as opposed to another? And was it a matter of the personalities or the types of people that would go into one or another? Because I do
maybe, but to a certain degree, but I think that the ideological tendencies hardened mostly in response to Reaganism. Mm-hmm. So I think that when Reaganism happened, when Thatcherism happened, I think that was the moment when these tendencies that came out of the New Left realized that they had failed, and there was a general crisis. Most of these organizations really lost most of their membership around the Thatcher and Reagan turn. And so what you had left in the 1980s were kind of rump memberships of these various tendencies who were much more just strictly ideologically committed. And that involved a kind of, a notion of strategy and tactics that they just pursued. And so Workers' World Party, the Marcyites, they had split with Trotskyism in the 50s over the Korean War and other things, and over Black nationalism versus the Civil Rights Movement and this kind of thing. But, generally, again, from my perspective, I had quit the Spartacus League in my last year of college, and I sort of took a break from the left for a while. And then I was called back by the millennials, by my students, who wanted to hear more about what I thought about politics, besides the kind of Marxism that I taught academically. And so that's how Platypus started, is basically my students roped me in. And, because they wanted to take these ideas into a more practical political realm. And my attitude was that, we had to be very modest about what we were doing. I was very realistic about my students and what they were capable of and what they were not capable of. And so I thought, okay, well, basically the left is a bunch of ideological tendencies that miseducates unwary youth and serves just an intellectual, ideological, theoretical function. It doesn't, like all the different tendencies, they all basically do the same thing. And none of them have any effect other than to help organize this kind of protest pressure tactic on the Democratic Party, essentially. And, be part of the broad opposition to Reaganism in the 80s, and then broad opposition to neoliberalism in the 90s, and then be part of the anti-war movement in the 2000s. And you'll notice that these groups didn't have much to do with the protests in the wake of the Great Recession.
Yeah.
Right, that these groups were pretty much sidelined, and you got instead the kind of anarchism of Occupy Wall Street. Until it all folded, the millennials all folded into the DSA.
Can I ask one more question, and then I'll let you go, Caleb? Why is that? Because I experienced that directly, that the Marxist groups I knew didn't want to get involved with Occupy Wall Street, and I was really surprised by it. What was it about those sectarian groups that block them from trying to tail the anti-Wall Street sentiment around
Well,
that
Occupy
time.
Wall Street wasn't a protest demo. It wasn't that kind of thing. It was, these encampments. Basically, that's when it all started. There were anti-austerity protests in
Right.
California and in the UK, and then it became Occupy Wall Street. And the Squares movement, in the Mediterranean world, we can say. And so, in Greece, but then the Arab Spring partook of this. And I feel like the Marxist left groups didn't really have a way of engaging that phenomenon, right? So, but to get back to your point, Doug, so I do think that the new left sort of failed, played out, ossified, became happy to exist on the fringes of the Democratic Party, and the Trotskyists maybe less obviously, and the post-Trotskyists less obviously than like the Stalinists and the Maoists, who got much more directly involved in the Democratic Party in the 80s and 90s. FRSO and other organizations. But that again, the millennial moment, I knew that the future of the left was not going to be through these organizations. The future of a socialist left was not going to be through these organizations. Now, I will have to say that I was shocked that it all ended up pretty much in the DSA, because for me, the DSA was kind of a joke when I was younger. The DSA was a joke, and and Michael Harrington was kind of whatever I might respect him in some ways, kind of a joke. He was like Chomsky to me. He was like a joke, meaning he was someone who would just sort of do these bromides and, and so the fact that Bhaskar Sankara was a member of the YDSA and, then rejuvenated it through Jacobin and, and we knew Bhaskar early on before he did all of that. And, so it's just, it's amusing to me, but it also makes sense in a certain way because the DSA was a phenomenon of the 80s. It was very much a post-New Left phenomenon, and so it's appropriate that the millennial left, if they were going to fold back into the Democratic Party, that it would take that form. It would take the form of the DSA.
So
because
Caleb,
that's what the DSA was designed to do.
Caleb, when you hear Chris and I discuss the ossification of these parties, one of which you were a part of for a little while, do you object to his explanation as to what happened, or do you find yourself in agreement with it? And how would you explain the current state of these socialist parties and the so-called Marxist left?
Well, so I agree kind of with some of what was said, but I also, I observed some of this. First of all, the first thing, post 2008, I have written about this, and it was a big moment for me. Because I remember Obama got in, the Tea Party was protesting Obama, the financial crisis had just happened, and out of the blue, the front page of Newsweek, we're all socialist now. And,
right.
New York Times was running pieces about the Brecht Forum. Hey, look at the Brecht Forum. Isn't that nice? And that there was a section of the ruling class, like the Warren Buffett kind of faction. Warren Buffett did the whole tax me more. Why does my secretary... And they were basically just saying to the communist groups, can you guys go out and do your thing, please? Like they had already determined that they were not a threat. They were not going to overthrow capitalism, but they thought they'd be useful in like strengthening Obama against the Tea Party. And the communist groups just went out and they fell on their faces. And the ruling class didn't even realize how ineffective they are. They knew they were not a threat, but they didn't know that Occupy was like take two. They're like, oh shit, we thought the communists could do this. Okay, now and then they flew in the George Soros, the Color Revolution people as like take two. And I was there and I watched this, and that the ruling class was handing out foundation money to these people and just do your thing, go do your thing.
Wall Street read Marx.
Yeah. Michael Moore had Capitalism: A Love Story, which people were in that. And it was just like no. Yeah, it was that.
Well, David Graeber. When you get to the point of David Graeber,
yeah,
I will say something very unkind. You're scraping the bottom of the barrel.
The ruling class, they knew the groups were not a threat. They didn't realize how ineffective they were. And all the little like Leninist groups, they all got a little bit of a boost then, and they all had their chance, and they were just not capable of really doing anything. And and it was really, really tragic.
They wanted a left version of the Tea Party.
Yeah, and the ruling class, they had to make their own, basically. Occupy they had to make their own version of it, because they were counting on the left as this entity that would always kind of be there, that was tied in with North Korea or whatever, and would just
had a pressure, a pressure. Like, I think the second term Obama, like Occupy Wall Street was all about wanting something better from Obama in the second term.
Yeah. The other thing was that, you talked about how these groups, in a way, like they were all rebuilding and all of that, but there was one of the biggest weaknesses that they had, right? And this kind of, I think, is a strong justification for some of the trolling that your organization has done. They had this loyalty to the left. And I've talked about the Boston trap. That's when my writings, I've written frequently about the Boston trap. I was in the Workers' World Party. Every year we had our national convention. Every year there would be a speech about the Boston busing riots of 1974. Every year, and how in 1974, they integrated the schools of Boston, school busing, and there had been these racist riots against them, and how some of these Maoists had supported those racist riots, and that was an unforgivable thing. But luckily, the Workers' World Party, we organized these rallies that weren't for busing, but they were like, we say no to racism, and that it was like this feeling that you should never support anything right wing, and that you always had this loyalty to, they wouldn't say it, but loyalty to the Democrats. The Democrats are always better than the Republicans. There's this evil, scary thing called the right wing, and they can't exactly tell you what it is, but it's evil and scary, and there can be no compromise with it, and that the place of the left is in opposition to the right wing, right?
They've been calling the Republicans fascists since FDR.
Yeah, and that outlook in the age of Trump, that is why the left has no future, because at this point, the left wing is the voice of the mainstream of imperialism, and Americans that are just not supporting the FBI, don't know what to believe about vaccines or whatever, are going in places, and that they all have this mind block of, no, we can't support anything right wing, you know what I mean? And they have this mind block, and that is why they are trapped, right? And a lot of it is trauma. I'll just tell you, a lot of these old boomer leftists, they have gotten punched in the face and hit with baseball bats and gotten into fist fights, and they have like a gut level, like flags offend them. Anything related to Christianity offends them on, like, it's not rational. It's like, these are my enemies. They see an American flag, they see a Bible, and they want to start punching. And it's not rational. And that's why they're trapped. And they won't capture any of the populist outrage against the American state. As far as DSA, one thing I noticed, I mean, and it's funny because you said they were a joke back in your day. They were a joke when I remember during the Iraq War days, people didn't know they were still around. They would see their name, and people didn't know they were still around. And that though the more you look into it, DSA was very much, it was like, as China's politics were shifting and as the political crisis of the early 70s was coming to an end, DSA was very much like a deprogramming operation. It was where all these Maoist communists and some Trotskyites too, it was like, you can now be a Democrat, right? And we have this vehicle to speak your language and talk to you. And they had a lot of funding from the United Auto Workers. I think Doug Fraser was funding them. And they would put on these conferences of like, you did the communist thing. Now let's grow up and all just be Democrats. And in 1984, Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign and also the Harold Washington campaign for mayor of Chicago was a way to just bring these people in. And it very much mirrored, there was the whole deprogrammer movement that was going on where like the Unification Church was being targeted and people would be kidnapped and all of that. And it was like a psychological operation. They viewed Leninism as brainwashing.
As a version of the 70s cults.
They viewed Leninism as totalitarian mind control. And it was like, we're going to deprogram you by bringing you into DSA. And it was this, a lot of this is related to intelligence and very weird, but there was a lot of, in the lead up to Reagan taking office, there was a really intense fight within the ruling class that's very ugly. A lot of leftists love to talk about 68, 69. That was the glorious years. But you notice a lot of these communist groups, most of the books that they wrote and published, 79.
70s. Late 70s.
There was a very ugly fight in the ruling class. The transition from Carter to Reagan was pretty intense. And that in those years, that's when a lot of these groups got fighting. And that's also the time when like David Duke revived the KKK and was doing his national speaking tour. Right. And that's also the heyday of unificationists, and LaRouche was that's when he got to be big. There was a big fight Reagan versus Carter, the military-industrial complex, and Reagan versus kind of the Brzezinski wing of the ruling class, the Trilateral Commission. And there was kind of a fight, and a lot of that's like, the RCP. That's when Bob Avakian, had his death to Deng Xiaoping rally. That's when the Greensboro massacre of 1979 happened, and that there was like an ugly ruling class fight, and all these groups were kind of like pawns in like a fight within the power structure. That's kind of how I see things during those years. And DSA was part of that, and it was part of like de-radicalizing.
Yeah, coming out of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of my reaction to what you said there. I don't disagree exactly. I feel like our analysis overlaps based on what we both observed.
So it sounds like to me you're both saying in different ways that the left, as it is now, is actually just another part of the apparatus, not to use Althusserian language or anything, but another part of the state.
Yes.
And it may be part of the Democratic Party or aligned with it. It might be at times even aligned with the Republican Party. That seems very rare, but it could happen, I suppose. But overall, like when you say that Occupy Wall Street was just take two for the ruling class, that certainly at the time I would have been shocked to hear that. And I was already 40, but I definitely thought that Occupy was a grassroots
You have to
protest.
think about how it's functioning at a structural level. Again, not to be a structuralist, but to just say, well, what can this do? All it can do is register a protest against Obama's reelection, in the sense of we want better the second time, because they certainly didn't want Romney, right? But I think that it's important for us to note that both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump decided to run in 2016 in the aftermath of 2012. Meaning it was coming at a disappointment with Obama, that both Trump and Bernie were disappointed with Obama, and not even for very different reasons, in fact. So that's where those candidacies in 2016 came from, and we've been living in the aftermath of that. So Bernieism, Trumpism, left populism, right populism, Zoran Mamdani, the latest iteration, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Trumpist, anti-Trumpist, dissident, loyal, that this is the moment that we're still in. And I understand all of that as just being a function of the capitalist politics of the ruling class.
Well, Chris, you said something that I want to ask you about. You said when you talk about David Graeber, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel. I'm not a fan of David Graeber, but I thought that was sort of odd because you're talking about a barrel that's filled with the same bad apples all the way down, maybe, right? You're
it's just that particular, like the fact that he was the leading light for Occupy, because he's a peculiar kind of anarchist. He's not just any anarchist. He's a very specific kind of anthropological anarchist. He's like a Marshall Solins student. He's not even a Chomskyan or Michael Albert kind of anarchist. He's a very idiosyncratic anarchist. And that's what I mean by...
Well, that was his strength.
No, sure, that was his strength. However, right...
No, because at that moment, you couldn't turn to these other older leftists who had been...
That's true.
So
no, I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that because, insofar as I take the history of the left and the socialist movement and Marxism seriously, I also take the history of anarchism seriously. Meaning, this kind of weird, maybe it's also because Graeber's more our generation.
Yeah.
I
feel like there's some self-hate in
there is, absolutely, because I'm like, look, we're on a steep come down here. I mean, I thought Chomsky was a steep come down from historic anarchism, let alone David Graeber, right?
Yeah.
And yet, Chomsky knew his Kropotkin and Bakunin and Proudhon, whereas I feel like, Graeber wants to sort of is a Proudhonian and whatnot, but wants to sort of reinvent anarchism whole cloth based on like anthropology. And so it just has a logical character to it. So, basically my point, just to be very concise, you can't even say that Occupy Wall Street was anarchist as opposed to the Marxism of the anti-war movement. You can't even really say that.
No, but it was a different set of tactics. put
I
together.
wish it had been more hardcore anarchist, actually, because that would have shown more possibility, I think.
Mhm.
I was in Charlotte, North Carolina for like months in 2012, building like the protests against the Democratic National Convention. What you said about Occupy, you don't know how right you are. Like, so in the lead up to, the convention, we were negotiating with the police, and, we could only be in this really far away. There can be no tents in the parks, all of this. And as soon as the Democrats showed up, they said, we want you in a park, and we want you right next to the convention site. And you remember that night where Elizabeth Warren gave her "corporations are not people" speech? They literally had the CNN cameras pointed at the Occupy camp that the police had like arranged for us, basically. And it was like, cut, to show this. And it was like part of the Obama, like, it was like he was capturing the Occupy energy to get reelected. Right. I remember that. It was pretty wild. And the other thing is, I think probably one of the most telling and most important things that we need to be aware of, you want to talk about leftism, is the fact that, the Uhuru movement, the African People's Socialist Party, yes, they were raided by the FBI in 2022. They were indicted for their speech, for the crime of speaking up in support of Russia, and they were dragged into federal court, and the communist movement barely supported them. Almost
nobody supported them. Yeah,
none of them.
Right.
Based on rumors on the internet that they're a cult, based on Russia bad, Russiagate, and all of that. And 30 years ago, it would have been common sense. The U.S. government arrests a group of black socialists and calls them agents of Russia. Every communist you ever heard of would have been out there. The ACLU, they all would have been there. But in this case, who supported the Uhuru movement? Tucker Carlson. Right. He supported them. Glenn Beck supported them. Scott Ritter, who's not a leftist but is anti-war.
Scott Ritter, yeah.
We supported them, and we put like all our resources. That was our main thing as Center for Political Innovation, was to do everything we could to support them. But I was just utterly shocked that they
were left out to try.
Sublation supported them.
But there was so little support for them among the left, based on Trump derangement syndrome, based on and they're not even Trump supporters. They're just pro-Russia, that was really telling to me. And if you want,
they were critical of the war in Ukraine.
Dead. That's the left is dead. Yeah,
right. They were against the war in Ukraine, in a fairly typical way for the left.
Yeah,
anti-imperialist.
They were anti-imperialist leftists, and they have, my feeling was their political speech shouldn't be attacked by the FBI, and it was completely trumped up charges, and it should have been on everyone's lips.
The Nation had published an article, and I'm forgetting the University of Chicago professor's name, who's a Russianist. Is it Stephen Cohen?
Oh yeah, he died though.
Yeah, he's since died, but he wrote early on with Trump. He wrote an article on the dangers of excessive anti-Russianism. And, this is before, it's after the Crimean seizure in 2014, but really before the full brunt of Russiagate and Russia collusion hoax, all of that stuff. And basically it was kind of like, look, how far do we want to go with this, accusing Trump of being a Russian asset? And he, linked it with a U.S. foreign policy, anti-Russia orientation, and he basically said this is not going to end well, and it hasn't. Meaning the Ukraine war. The way I wrote about this was that the Democrats thought that they were fighting against Trump in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. So again, it's a curious thing, but the Uhuru movement, no, that was a travesty, and I almost feel like it's like they had to target a black organization because Biden represented like black Democrats or something. It was like it had a certain appropriateness to it in its evil character, for sure. So yes. So anyway, I am interested though, Caleb. What other questions do you have for me? Because I kind of feel like you certainly have not asked me all of them.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm curious. So, when you launched Platypus, the Spartacists were like stalking you and going to all of your events, and they had dug up some quote where you had said Malcolm X was a sociopath or something. And like, why did they is it just that you're viewed as an apostate? You were in the group and you left, and so they have to, go after you? Was it purely that, or was there like some big difference you had with them when you left or something? Or
So I quit. I was kind of pushed out, but I quit back in 1993. And, I was kind of head of a Spartacus youth club at my school at Hampshire College, but also in the greater 5-college area of Western Massachusetts. And they really targeted me in a way that's typical for them, which is that they have a kind of avowed programmatic strategy, which when you absorb a group, the goal is to eliminate the leader of the group and absorb all the members of the group. But that you have to eliminate the original leader of the group. So they saw our Spartacus Youth Club as a group that they wanted to absorb, but in order to do so, they had to get rid of me. And so, and so I was a petty bourgeois intellectual who wanted to go to graduate school. And meanwhile, I'm from a working class background. And of course, why shouldn't I go to graduate school? They all were doctors and lawyers and professors, the cadre of the Spartacus League. Very few of them were actually workers. And so, so I quit because of, problems with them, but also because of the general mood. So when Clinton was elected, when the left protested 500 years of racism, sexism, homophobia, genocide with the quincentenary of Columbus, and when the LA riots happened, and it was called a rebellion or even a revolution. And I just thought, yeah, I'm done with the left here. Because I just thought all the pseudo-radicalism ultimately fed into the election of Bill Clinton. And ultimately, all my leftist professors and all my leftist fellow students were just completely relieved and even rejoicing at the election of Bill Clinton. And I just thought, okay, obviously I thought I was doing something that I really wasn't doing. I thought I was participating in a kind of socialist left informed by Marxism. It turns out it's just 12 years of Reaganism, and ultimately people just wanted the Democrats back. I remember my Marxist professors were extremely interested in the Clarence Thomas hearings. And I was like, why? Oh, it's really important that people believe Anita Hill and stop Clarence Thomas. And I was like, how is that getting us to socialism?
Yeah.
Right. So, that's my history with the Spartacus League. Although I stayed friendly with them. I moved out to Chicago. I got in contact with their chapter here. I remained a subscriber to Workers' Vanguard. I would occasionally go to their events, and there was no hostility. Until started Platypus.
Oh.
And we invited them to speak on the panels, and they were like, no. So they rather heckle from the audience than be on a panel, because they're sort of uncomfortable with that. But anyway, yeah, so there's a story there, but there's not much to the story.
Why has Platypus been so controversial to so many different left organizations, do you think, Chris? Why? Well, I mean, because most of the time, one of these leaders of a sectarian group would be thrilled at the chance to speak to a college audience.
They're not used to that, though. They're not used to that. And I would say that so the Spartacists were hostile in their way, but the group that was most hostile to us, I think, Workers' World was a little hostile, but the ISO was hostile. Where did Caleb go?
I don't know, but he did make a
I just have to adjust the lighting. 1 second.
Okay, great. So the ISO and the SWP in the UK were extremely hostile. And, it makes sense to a certain degree because they were very prominent in the anti-war movement around the Iraq War, but even their members spoke on our panels. So there hasn't been like a rock solid hostility from any tendency, really. I think that people have flashed hot and cold with Platypus over the years. And the other thing is that, we were the venue through which older leftists could get access to campus to speak to students. That's how we were positioned. And so they liked that, but they also resented it. And also their general orientation, all these groups were seeking to recruit people, and then they realized, oh, Platypus is not creating an environment that's friendly to recruitment. And that's where they, saw us as serving a more nefarious purpose. And so let me just say one other thing, because there was a boycott letter by this guy Ben Campbell, who was in Platypus after Occupy and then quit. And he quit along with a group of people who had come into Platypus around Occupy Wall Street, and that
small and irrelevant and getting smaller. It is certain people's private property.
Yes.
And they feel very, very upset. And I've often said the left functions like a cartel, like a criminal cartel, where it's like you have the different gangs that don't like each other and are rivals, but they all will agree to lock out anyone they see as like not part of the cartel. And then that's how these communist groups work. They all know each other. These movements know each other for decades. And like when I was in Workers' World, there was even an element of like, someone would quit Workers' World and join CPUSA. So CPUSA would then call Workers' World and be like, tell us about this. It was like that level of, we're all kind of in the same business. And, that's a really big part of the weakness of leftism, is that it's kind of run by a cartel. And I would argue to some degree or other, I don't know how much the intelligence and the FBI, how much of a role they play in keeping it that way, whether this is just the way it's developed or whether it's intentional. I will say one case I studied, and maybe your organization observed this as well. In New York City, like maybe a decade ago, there was a faction that was not one of these old leftist groups. It was called the Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee. It was like a weird Maoist group on the college campuses. And it was revealed that the New York City Police Department spent hundreds of millions of dollars to crush them. And I mean, and that made no sense. The group was never more than 30 people. But I have determined it's because they were not predictable.
Part
of
the cartel.
Know what the World Party is going to do. They know what Answer, and they know what the CPUSA is going to do. But this was a new group that they didn't know what they might do, and they then embarrassed the former CIA director. What's his name when he was speaking at New York University? When he was a professor at CUNY. What was his name? David Petraeus.
Petraeus,
his classes. And it was a faction they couldn't really control, and they didn't know what was happening. So it was worth spending a lot of money to really just derail and control them. And I observed that. And one thing that I observed about them, this relates to what you shared about the emails, was that one thing I observed about Revolutionary Student Coordinating Committee was that anyone who appeared at all friendly to them, there would immediately be a lot of anonymous social media attacks on you. Right? If you were at all friendly to them, if you were, whichever communist group it was like offering and being like, hey, let's work together, immediately social media would be full of sectarian, childish, nasty personal attacks.
Right.
And I believe that was how the state was keeping them isolated, was that, and that maybe there were people within the group, like real people that were more sectarian in their nature, but it was like, we're going to amp up this kind of hateful internet personal character assassination to make sure that you don't develop a relationship with any existing group. And I thought that was quite interesting as well.
I mean, that is my general outlook, is that this is COINTELPRO type shit. Whether or not it's actually being done by the state, it objectively serves that function.
Yeah.
And I think that, cancel culture on the left, is a species of this, which is, look, you're doing the state's work for it, whether knowingly or unknowingly, whether manipulated or just on your own, you're still doing the state's work.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem I've noticed with a lot of younger people is that they don't see the value. I mean, like what you're doing, regardless, maybe I disagree with you completely, but there's a value in what you're doing. Is you're building an organization, you're bringing people together, you're publishing, and that a lot of younger people in the age of the internet, they don't see the value in that at all. But they feel that there has been a real effort to train young people to think that if they can take somebody down, right? If they can,
they've accomplished something.
That is a great achievement in and of itself. And it is not actually,
what I mean? It's very destructive. Yeah.
Right. And that, and that this is this game that is played where it's like, that's kind of how leftist culture is developed, is like, well, I'm going to be the one to take this one down. It's like, what are you accomplishing? I mean, it's, yeah.
Right. No, I completely agree. And so my attitude, and this is, overlap, but also just in the campaign for a socialist party, is that, I really think that we have to enforce norms of comradely behavior and fight antisocial behavior. I think that a lot of identity politics is basically antisocial behavior, and as uncomradely. And so, like I said, Ross Wolf, leaked some ISO emails, and it's just something that I would never do, and I would never want anyone to do, because I don't want to be actually harmful or destructive towards people on the left.
Yeah.
Whatever differences I might have with them, I still see no point in that. And in that it's bad at a cultural level. It establishes a bad culture.
Yeah.
And like I said, even if I'm really opposed to someone and think that they are the enemy of proletarian socialist revolution, I don't want to be a state agent, which is essentially what you're doing when you try to take someone down personally.
Yeah.
Or try to take down an organization.
Yeah, and I think, again, how much of this is COINTELPRO and how much of this is just the culture that is developed, and I think it's just how people have come to think of things. And people don't, there are certain new parties that have sprung up in recent years, and I look at them and I'm like, this is not a real party. The
affinity groups.
Yeah, when I was in the Workers' World Party, the PC USA was formed. They really wanted me to join. And I knew Dr. Angelo D'Angelo was their founder. And I knew, George Grunthal, who was, this older like Maoist who lived in Harlem. And they were like, why not join us? You agree with us more than that, than Workers' World. Why are you in Workers' World? I said, because Workers' World's a real group. They have a real office. You guys are an internet club. And they were like, what does that mean? And I've known people in PC USA, and I've known they attract a lot of young people that are very interested in communism and the history of the Communist Party in particular, but they don't do anything, right? And they just get on Zoom calls and it's like they have a million little like mass organizations that have only their members in it, and they have Zoom
right front groups.
It's just they just sit on their computers talking to each other, but they don't know anything different. It's like the idea of what these mass parties you talked about in the 30s they don't even understand that, right? Groups that have, community organizations that are getting people elected to office, that are, pushing legislation, that are, they don't understand any of that. It's just like no comprendo. It's like, so why wouldn't I just join an internet club? That's how a lot of these young people are. And it's a tragedy. And that those of us who have actually built something, it's almost like our responsibility to show what a real group could be.
Right.
So that's a point of agreement.
Caleb, I'm playing the role of the average leftist here, just trying to make sense of everything. On the one hand, the problem has been the way in which these left organizations are absorbed by the Democrats, particularly, and by capitalist politics. But on the other hand, you just seem to say that what makes a left organization legitimate is their ability to play ball within capitalist politics. So is there a vision of a mass party or a socialist party that you have that would not end up, aligning with candidates or policies or legislation first, or maybe at all?
Well, I think it would be a question of aligning with candidates and policies out of its own agenda, not just becoming adjacent to part of the power structure. I think that would be the thing to have, I think the phrase, if I remember correctly, maybe it's in Marx, maybe it's somewhere else, they talk about independent historical action, right? And that maybe they enter an alliance, but they do it on the basis of their own principles. One thing I've heard you, Chris, many times say that you think the Popular Front was like the worst period or whatever. I view that as the heyday of American communism. I view that, I think really nothing that called itself communist in American history since then has ever had anywhere near the power and influence. And that was, the Popular Front years when Roosevelt was entering an alliance with the Communist Party, when the Communist Party, they entered a strategic alliance with Roosevelt, and they did, to some degree or other, I think they acknowledged that Earl Browder did, water down the political line and took it to ridiculous extremes, like supporting Japanese internment and actually dissolving too, which they didn't have to do. But I view the Popular Front as that is almost like that's an example of communism actually having real influence and power in America, which you can't say it ever had since. What do you think?
Okay, so I would contextualize it with the preceding history of the Socialist Party, the pre-World War I Socialist Party, and the Socialist Party that was crushed in the Palmer raids in the Red Scare of 1919, which I think was actually worse than McCarthyism.
Yeah.
And I do think that the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs of that time was more of a social and political independent power with respect to the working class and proletarian socialism than the CP was in the 30s. I would measure them that way, meaning I see that era as part of the socialist left folding into progressivism. And whereas there was a clear demarcation from progressivism in the Debs era. And that line got fudged, and I think that that's been fatal to us. Now, on a more basic level, it's the whom question. Who's using whom? Meaning there might be a way that proletarian socialists can use petty bourgeois radicalism, petty bourgeois discontents, in capitalist politics, as long as they're using them and not being used. And that's always a fine line. But I think that generally speaking, by the 30s, there had already been a deterioration both domestically and in the international situation. I see other things. There's a larger context, like the CIO as a site of labor radicalism in the 30s, I feel like was too late, meaning it was an attempt to, in the Great Depression era, implement what was industrial unionism in the pre-World War I era, like the IWW. And I think that, again, that kind of socialist initiative with respect to labor before World War I, it sort of didn't go anywhere. And yet, by the time it did go somewhere, it's because this was the kind of unionism appropriate to that form of capitalism and to the politics of progressivism in the 30s. So again, I think that it is a matter of who's using whom and taking advantage of a situation versus being taken advantage of in that situation. Right. So I think that those are the kind of judgments. And, it's not like I want to relitigate history, but I do think that it's not accidental that the CIO became part of Cold War unionism after World War II. Mm-hmm. And it's not, in other words, I'm interested in the conditions under which it was possible to have the McCarthyite purges, meaning I don't blame McCarthyism. I have to look at what made the communists and Trotskyists and socialists vulnerable to McCarthyism. Because they shouldn't have been.
The economic boom, that their message of class struggle, when the USA had the highest standard of living in the world at the time, and the rest of the world had been blown up in the Second World War, and we were supplying the world with the auto and the steel and the suburbs, and that was, the USA had the highest standard of living by far at that time, and so the class struggle message wasn't going over. Plus, to be fair, Trotskyites will point out, and this is accurate, during the Second World War, the Communist Party burned a lot of bridges unnecessarily. And so they had burned a lot of the bridges with the radicals and the labor movement who'd been their friends. Plus, the economy was booming, so their message was not going over. And then on top of that, there were changes in information technology. There was this television that all these American workers had, this television that told them that Stalin was going to nuke them. And, and they were terrified. And they had images on their screen of, the Red Menace. And so the level of propaganda was higher than before. And I think that all of that made for kind of a perfect storm that led the Communist Party to be destroyed. One thing about the McCarthy era that always surprises me is how much they accomplished during it. And that blows my mind. I mean, the whole country was psyched up. They were public enemy number one. But yet they still split the Democratic Party in the 1948 election. And they basically, the Democrat vote was split three ways in 1948 between Henry Wallace, who was like the Communist Party aligned candidate, Harry Truman, who won, but also Strom Thurmond, because Harry Truman was forced to adjust his position on race so much that the Dixiecrats ran their own candidate. And I always tell people that image of, Dewey defeats Truman. The reason that is there's no way Truman could have won. The Democrats' vote was split three ways. It was only because of massive fraud in the urban centers that Truman was able to be reelected in 48, because Democrats weren't split once, they were split twice. Right. It was three-way. And that was the fact the Communist Party could split a major party three ways and still at a time when they were very weak. I mean, that's amazing. And the other thing is, a lot of, during that time, they kind of dug in, right? It was like, even though they were being persecuted, they had this kind of rally around the flag effect where, William C. Foster was the leader. They had the anti-Browder campaign, and they were like, the Soviet Union, that's our homeland. They built the Civil Rights Congress. They did amazing things. And also, by being public enemy number one, that got them a lot of, like, at the same time, they got a lot of publicity. Like, they were on the front page of the newspaper.
Sympathy, yeah.
So it kind of helped them in a weird way. What really did them in was the secret speech. After all they'd been through, and you'll notice that they started legally functioning right before the secret speech. Like, there was almost like an understanding that this is going to happen. And the secret speech, Khrushchev's secret speech, that's what killed them. Right? They've never been a relevant political force. But arguably, if the secret speech hadn't happened and they had maintained the level of cohesion and discipline that they had coming out of, McCarthyism, they could have very well in the 60s become a really big force to be reckoned with. But that secret speech, that was too much. That devastated them.
Chris, what's your opinion of the secret speech? Do you think that that was something that happened that was disingenuous and that was an attack on the struggle for socialism and a problem for the left? Or
I don't. No, I don't. I see it as the crisis of Stalin. Meaning, I think that there were many factors to this, but I think that the expansion into Eastern Europe, the Chinese Revolution, and we can also include in that the Korean and Vietnamese revolutions. I think that there was a real crisis of Stalinism that was brewing. It was brewing before Stalin died, Tito, and it Khrushchev was trying to keep it together. And so, it's not like I'm a Khrushchevite, but I think that he was attempting to kind of reset the international communist movement that was under a great deal of pressure in the 50s. And even though in some ways it was winning, the Korean War, the U.S. lost the Korean War. It did. And obviously the U.S. lost China. Who lost China? Now, and there was a move to liberalization in Eastern Europe before Khrushchev's speech. So I think that Stalinism had experienced an impasse and a crisis in the 50s. And that there was a need for a renewal of the proletarian socialist movement. And that occurred both on one side of the Iron Curtain and on the other side of the Iron Curtain. This was endemic. It wasn't just in the East. It was in the West too. And so these parties, this is the basis for the New Left. The New Left came out of the crisis of Stalinism. And, that's why things like the Cuban Revolution became so symbolically important.
Earlier, Caleb said that the New Left came out of McCarthyism and the embrace by Cold War liberals of the FBI and the deep state. It seemed to me that's what I heard you say. Maybe I'm misremembering, Caleb. You can correct me, but it almost seemed to me that you were saying that the New Left was kind of like Occupy. That
the state
it was
plot.
A state plot. Is it? Would you say that's what it was?
Me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would say that McCarthyism went from being simply an anti-communist purge. McCarthyism had three stages. The first stage was the Democrats clearing the Roosevelt wing. The Roosevelt wing wanted to continue an alliance with the Soviet Union, and that was considered a threat to American foreign policy. So they purged. It was the Kennedys, it was the Democrats, the Catholic urban Democrats purging the Rooseveltists, basically. That was the first stage. Then the second stage became who lost China, Republicans accusing Democrats of being communists. And then there was a third stage where it was Joe McCarthy and this kind of middle class uprising against the American political establishment. They were going after the CIA. They were going after, the U.S. Army. They were going after all kinds of prevailing institutions in the name of anti-communism. And it was a threat to the ruling class. A member of Congress committed suicide. Lester Hunt committed suicide because Joe McCarthy blackmailed him. It was they were exercising power in a way that was a threat to the American status quo and was hurting U.S. foreign policy. The USA was funding Yugoslavia because Yugoslavia had broken. But then McCarthy was saying, "Oh, you're giving money to a communist government," and Voice of America, the main propaganda outlet, couldn't do its job of demonizing the Soviet Union, because if they said anything that might validate, say like, okay, well, you have a point here, but then they were accused of being soft on communism. Right. And that, McCarthyism was crippling U.S. imperialism. And also, you have to talk about the role of Mossad. Who revealed that Joe McCarthy was gay, right? Who revealed it? It was Hank Greenspun of the Las Vegas newspaper, who stole millions of dollars of military equipment from army bases in Nevada and gave it to Israel and was pardoned for it by Kennedy. He was a Mossad operative. McCarthy was anti-Israel, probably for anti-Semitic and Catholic, traditionalist, conservative, far-right reasons. But the McCarthyists didn't like Israel because Israel had diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union, had the Labor Party. Right. And the McCarthyists were viewed as a threat to Israel. So between Mossad and the prevailing institutions of the U.S. state, McCarthyism had to be crushed. And it's interesting. Like, I think William F. Buckley, who's kind of the father of the neoconservatism, he was originally on KPFK, the like Pacifica radio station in LA, bashing McCarthyism as a conservative against McCarthyism, and that the deep state saw McCarthyism as potentially illiberal. The other thing that's interesting is you talk about the Korean War during the
wait, just to clarify that, and you would say then that the New Left was the state's response to McCarthyism, to suppress McCarthyism,
and also make sure that nothing like the Communist Party emerged to be the anti-McCarthyism vehicle.
Right. So it was like make sure that they controlled how the anti-McCarthyism would arise. It wouldn't actually be from the Soviets themselves or from real communists, but rather it was a
Aren't these things just the sort of the details? Meaning, I think that we can get lost in the details. Meaning, obviously there's the issue of governing capitalism, and there's the perennial struggle of progressivism and conservatism within capitalist politics. And these things rearrange themselves periodically as different industries have more or less prominence, rise and fall. And as, conditions on the ground change, and also as diplomatic needs in terms of international policy, those needs change. And so, I don't think that Walter Reuther funding the civil rights movement or funding the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, has to be in the interest of one wing or another of the ruling class in some direct way. It can just be a matter of, we'd like to push things in a certain direction. And we have one version of progressivism versus another version of progressivism. In other words, there are like cliques that fight against each other. There are rackets, but that, the general tendency is that capitalism requires political renewal, and we'll find resources for doing so. And, youth movements, like protest movements, discontents, they draw from that in order to renew the establishment. In other words, it happens a variety of ways. It doesn't have to be like just this or that faction. Like, things kind of fall into place because these factions ultimately have to coexist with each other and never quite defeat each other definitively.
Right.
That never really happened.
Let me ask you a clarifying question, Chris. If Caleb is right, and the New Left was fundamentally a project of the deep state, let's say, just to be, flat-footed about it, and was backed as a way to combat McCarthyism and the Soviet threat simultaneously. If that's all true, could it also be the case that at a certain moment in time, maybe for a few years, the New Left had revolutionary potential?
Oh, yeah, it would indicate that. I mean, look, what we have to think about is how to navigate changes in capitalist politics that will unsettle things and will politicize people and will create changes in capitalism will create new opportunities. Now, my big caveat with respect to this is that I don't think that divisions within the ruling class in and of themselves provide enough of an opportunity. In other words, I do think that we have to have practices, strategies that are independent of capitalist politics, and therefore not dependent on capitalist politics going this way or that way, or being in stability or crisis, because we don't really have any control over that. So the only question is, how do we weather it? How do we navigate that? Because we're not in control of the currents of capitalist politics at all, and we can't hope to be, because we want to do something else, right? We want to build up the working class's power in a way that it doesn't matter which party is in power. It doesn't matter what the law is. It doesn't matter what the administrative policies are. We have to do what we have to do regardless of the situation, right? Which means a certain amount of flexibility, but it also means not like pinning our hopes on what's going on in the capitalist political domain, and not chasing after the mirage of this will be our opening.
Mm-hmm. Caleb, what do you
That's my caveat.
I think that matches what I've put forward in, like, Where is America Going? I talked about top and bottom organizing, building your own apparatus, setting up shop, having your own organization, but then entering alliances strategically as a way of intervening in the current controversies and discourses, but always doing so in a way that builds up your own forces. Right. And that the revolutionary organization has those two roles, I guess, is building its own ranks, but also intervening in the ongoing political struggle.
The older tradition, though, that I hark back to, which is, the SPD in Germany and the RSDLP before World War I, they were not dealing with like czarists and, Junkers, and, they were not. Like, there were other leftist and so even socialist and even like Marx informed tendencies, like the Narodniks and the socialist revolutionaries, who were very much involved in the internecine conflicts within the Tsarist state or within the German Prussian state. The Marxists were not. The SPD was not. The RSDLP was not. They really were independent. And also the Socialist Party of America was very independent of the Democrats and the Republicans.
Well, I would beg to differ, especially when it comes to Russia, because it seemed like so much of what the Bolsheviks and the RSDLP were doing prior to 1917 was they were aligned as part of this broader movement against Tsarist autocracy, which a lot of capitalists were part of. They wanted a liberal democratic state, and that they were heavily involved in that, right? They wanted a liberal democratic state, and they were aligning with capitalists, aligning with everybody against Tsarism, right?
Well, aligning, but working with, like aligning and collaborating, it's a little bit different.
Well, they built industrial unions, but they were like the industrial union wing of this democratic movement against Tsarism.
Yes. What I'm saying is that it was other groups who were more implicated in the machinations of the dominant politics. And I think that, again, that's where the sort of line, there is sort of a line, a threshold.
Yeah, and the April thesis was Lenin coming back and saying, you got to actually be independent now. Now is our moment. You can't just be part of this, right? We have to have our own line now, right? That was my understanding. But even what Lenin was doing was in alliance with a lot of Russian capitalists that wanted peace with Germany, because Germany was a business partner. And that Lenin, yeah, and that, I mean, as far as the SPD, the SPD, I generally, I think you're right, they represented the industrial movement in Germany more than anything in its own interest. They ultimately just, when the World War I crisis came in, it was a question of losing everything they had built in German society and becoming outlawed and crushed, or, and they weren't willing to do that. And as far as the Socialist Party of America, my understanding is the Socialist Party of America was such a broad tent. You had basically like Methodist ministers who thought socialism meant, food stamps, and you had like wobbly, bomb throwing radical, and it was just anybody and everything. And Debs was kind of the public. He wasn't even a member of the Socialist Party himself, from what I understand, right? He was just kind of the public voice.
Initially, no, and then he did become, right.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, there you go. Yeah. I don't.
They didn't have the opportunity the left. They didn't have the opportunities that the left has now. Mm-hmm. Even in terms of, and obviously conditions are different. That's why, like when you're talking about Tsarist autocracy or Prussian autocracy, obviously conditions are different than in the United States. And the temptations are greater in a place like the United States to collaborate with capitalist politics. I mean, just to make a side note on the deep state, you know, in a way, the deep state is so pervasive that it's hard to avoid.
Yeah.
And yet, also, one can, you know, like, in other words, one can resist manipulation by the deep state. Meaning, when I bring up people like the socialist revolutionaries, the Narodniks, they were much more readily manipulable by the Tsarist state than even the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks were much more resistant to that kind of manipulation than the SRs were. And it did have to do with the fact that the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks were seen as too narrowly focused on the industrial working class, too Marxist, too orthodox. Whereas the socialist revolutionaries were like, no, we have to be broader than that. You know, we have to represent democracy. You know, we don't have to be such orthodox Marxists. We don't have to be so, you know, working class centric, you know. And so that's where I feel like Marxism itself has conceded a lot of ground to what people like Lenin would have completely rejected.
I need to wrap it up pretty soon here because we're coming up on 2 hours. But Caleb, do you have any more questions for Chris? Or Chris, do you have any more questions for Caleb?
I'll just ask my last question, which is that one reason that we in CPI are not calling ourselves communists anymore. I mean, it's for a number of different reasons, but one of the primary reasons is that we're not fighting for labor consciousness. Because if you look at the way the economy is organized, we're moving toward a gig economy. And in the gig economy, every worker sees themselves as an entrepreneur. Uber drivers compete with other Uber drivers to get rides. They have to be clever, and that we're not in a situation where you have the workers in the factory who have the same boss who are coming together to, you know, to make their demands. We're moving toward an economy where every worker is kind of like hustling for their daily existence in this kind of, you know, and sees themselves as an entrepreneur. And that's like Javier Milei was elected in Argentina because of this, because the young gig economy workers don't see themselves as workers, and Argentine law didn't respect them as such, right? So I guess my question is, should we be fighting for labor consciousness in this time, or do you feel that it's more of a demand for a state that works in the interest of the overall community, et cetera?
Right. Well, I would not conceive of my politics that way. So I would say that the condition that we're in, and this is actually, by the way, a conversation, Doug, you had with Benjamin Studebaker on Sublation recently, where he was talking about the difference between producer politics and consumer politics, and that we're kind of left now in this in-between state where we can't do producer politics the way it was done in the past, but we haven't yet transitioned to a place where all politics can be organized around consumer issues. And I just thought, well, look, there's actually another way of thinking about this, which is that, for instance, like labor politics, collective action by workers, there has to be conditions for that. So there has to be a community organizing to support that. And, you know, so I think there are Uber drivers and there are Uber drivers. In other words, there's the Uber driver who is a lone gunman, you know, like entrepreneur struggling against, you know, in a Darwinian fight for existence against all other Uber drivers and against Lyft drivers. But there's also the fact that the Uber driver is a member of the community. In order to be an Uber driver, they have to rely on what anarchist aid networks in that community that are immigrant community by necessity in a way that like class lacks.
You
and the
know,
white working class is more dependent on the state.
just an
And I think
observation
that
about Uber drivers, really briefly. Most of them have more than one job.
Yes,
Most Uber drivers drive for Uber during their weekends or during their off
that's
hours.
the evil of the gig economy, is that it seldom is completely divorced from wage labor. It's usually in supplementation of wage labor.
Wow.
Right. So I think that, you know, ultimately, like, the labor unions would have to be remade towards socialist ends, but I don't think that we're in a position to intervene in the established labor movement and make any changes there immediately. I think we'd have to set the conditions for that now. And so on the one hand, I think we should have a working class orientation, but what that actually means, like, it's not like the DSA rank and file strategy where they're trying to make the existing labor union wing of the Democratic Party more progressive and socialistic. No. I completely disagree with that, because I think that labor organizing now would mean breaking with the existing unions and would breaking the law, violating the law that exists. Like, I mean, that's one of the things that I was sort of talking about earlier about CIO and industrial unionism. It's submitted via the Taft-Hartley Act, and that's still there, and the NLRB and everything else. And so I think that, again, we need to approach it really as if we're starting from scratch, because we in fact are. So a movement for socialism is starting from scratch. And as far as the state is concerned, this is another issue that I'd take with Stalinism, is that I think that Stalinism made a virtue of necessity. And I think that there was a watering down and a kind of losing the plot on the Marxist view of the state. So there have been many more opportunities for the working class and for socialists and communists, even, like if you think of the Communist Party of France after World War II, to collaborate with the state in a way that simply was impossible before World War I. Like for the Eugene Debs Socialist Party, the SPD and the RSDLP, they just simply could not at all. And rather than saying, okay, well, you know, we want to take over the state, because I feel like that's what's really happened, is that the blurring of the line between socialism and progressivism is that what's entered into the mix is this idea that we want to take over the state. No, we want to smash the state. And that's where it's going to sound much more anarchist. But in fact, that's historical Marxism. And we have to figure out how to build a movement, again, independently, that will be in a position and to smash the state also when the social power to do so is such that smashing the state won't be such a big deal. Whereas today it's like, smash the state, what are you even talking about? That's impossible. Mm-hmm. No, right? So we have to organize independently of the state such that smashing the state is as without violence as possible, because it won't need to be, because basically the working class will be so strong that, you know, the police will scurry away, the military will split, you know, that it won't be a bloodbath because the workers will have built themselves up. And that could have been the case again, World War I, the SPD, like it's a complicated situation. It might have been the case, right? They were in a position where it might have been the case. And certainly I always emphasize that, you know, initially at least, the Russian Revolution was not this bloody affair. It was the right that turned it into that with the Civil War. And also the left that turned against the Bolsheviks, like the SRs, you know? So, you know, I think that, again, our imagination is inevitably colored by the intervening history, but we really need to disenthrall ourselves from that history, because I think there are a lot of misleading byways that we've been sucked down and all sorts of dead ends. So I think, you know, trying to figure out, okay, what would it mean to follow Marx's critique of the Gotha program as our roadmap in 2025?
All right. Any last questions from either of you, or?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll just add that, I mean, I don't think this is that much in opposition to what you're saying, but it's more a matter of building up the institutions, the networks that will become the new state than it is combating the old state. Right.
Right. Yes.
And the revolutionaries often, they get into this, well, we're going to fight the state. No, you're actually just going to build up the institutions that will become the vehicle of the new state. So
that's true. No, I completely agree with that. And that also means, I mean, at the level of like middle class radicals, again, there's a fine line. There's the whom problem of, will the working class be in a position to take the leadership with respect to middle class radicals, or will they be subordinated to the middle class radicals? Right? Because I think that the left has been in an orientation of hoping that they'd get the upper hand one day, but in the meantime subordinating themselves to middle class radicals. And again, what I'm advocating for with my campaign for a socialist party sounds more like anarchism, because I do think that we have to put ourselves on the path where we can not subordinate ourselves to middle class radicals. That's the challenge, because I think Otherwise, it's kind of like, well, you know, the middle class is oppressed by capitalism. Yes, of course they are, but they're also the path to subordination to capitalism, too. Right? They're in this in-between state. I mean, you know, I'm a Marxist. The middle class is both oppressed by capitalism and represents an interest in capitalism against the working class. And so the working class has to put them in a position where they will side with the workers instead of the capitalists. But in the meantime, ever since 1848, generally speaking, the alliance between the workers and the middle class radicals has been to the detriment of the workers. Hasn't worked out too well for the middle class either, but it definitely hasn't worked out well for the working class. And we're in a totally pulverized state. The working class is totally pulverized. It's totally absent or submitted to capitalism.
Yeah, I think the class line is fading. And I think it's increasingly just becoming a matter of, do you want a state that invests in the community and all of that? And that 21st century socialism is largely turned into, in China and Vietnam and places, a state that facilitates a middle class, that subsidizes, builds up, and controls and disciplines a working class in the interests of an overall national program. So I'm of the thinking
that's bad.
Well, but that's
bad. That's bad.
I mean, there's a friend of mine who's a very, I would say dogmatic, hardline Stalinist. And we were in a restaurant and they were ranting against China's market reforms. We were in a Mexican restaurant. And I said to them, how could the place like this exist in the Soviet style economy? You couldn't have that, right? You need a middle class, person who is controlled by the state, right? They can be controlled by the state and they'd have to carry out their business. But in order to have a Mexican restaurant that's really fun to eat at, you need a middle class. A state-run economy is not going to produce something like that, right? Completely.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And that their response was, well, under socialism, the government will just make the food really healthy and in the interest of society. And I'm thinking, yeah, you just don't get it,
No, don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. It's not about some immediate ultimatistic collectivism, right?
Yeah.
But it is about the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think that in a place like the United States, so we're not talking about Russia after World War I and after the Civil War, and we're not talking about Russia dependent on global capital and having to go it alone during the Great Depression and do a 5-year plan. We're not talking about China, right? Great leap forward, this kind of madness. We're talking about the United States, meaning the United States, could tolerate a great deal of a market economy and petty proprietorship and small businesses. It could tolerate that, right?
Yeah.
That wouldn't be an immediate threat to the dictatorship of the proletariat by any means.
No, I would argue nowadays that is the essence of what socialist planned economies are. Basically, is they're a central powerful state that then facilitates a market, and controls a market. I
think the difference between being the core capitalist country and being a peripheral country that's industrializing is qualitative. It's completely different.
Yeah.
And my attitude about China, it's not like I'm anti-China or anti-Vietnam or anti-Cuba or even anti-North Korea, for Christ's sake. That's not the point. The point is, what are the futures for these countries absent proletarian socialism in the United States? I don't think they have a happy future waiting for them.
Okay, I'm going to let Chris have the last word. Thank you very much for doing this, Caleb. Thank you, Chris. And I'll put this up next week. I'll let you both know when it goes up.
Awesome. Thanks
a lot, Caleb.
Thank you.